In the second part of the discussion on environmental protection framework, I want to talk about perspectives on resources and resource use. We can talk about two kinds of uses. We can define resource can be defined from at least two different perspectives. First is what we call consumptive use, as when petroleum is pumped from reserves, refined into gasoline, and consumed by commuters driving to work. Non-consumptive use is when people enjoy the scenic values of Afton Alps ski center slopes from the St. Croix River, but do not impair existence of the environmental entity in the process of using it. Resources are often classified in terms of rate of renewal. We can talk about stock resources that are not renewable. They involve a one-time use. And then we can also talk about renewable resources. In talking about stock resources, the supply of the resource value is fixed. Typically, there is only one opportunity for use. We can define stock resources from three perspectives. On the one hand, we have what the economists refer to as crustal abundance. This is the total amount of the entity that exists in the Earth's environment. Within the definition of crustal abundance, that is the amount of an entity that exists in the environment, there is what we can call technologically feasible, that which we actually have the technology to be able to develop. And then finally, we have what are called proven reserves that are known to exist in the environment, that are technologically feasible to develop, and in addition are profitable to exploit. We can define this graphically by talking about crustal abundance. The technical definition of crustal abundance is quite interesting. It's the amount of resource available in the average rock, whatever that means. At any rate, we can define crustal abundance, the amount of resource that's available in the environment. And we can talk, for example, on the Iron Range in northern Minnesota. We have two definitions of resource crustal abundance on the Iron Range. We have the high-grade concentrated iron ore resource, and we have the low-grade iron ore resource. A high-grade resource was pretty much exhausted after World War II, and the iron ore resource essentially was, quote, depleted. There was no more high-grade iron ore resource. The Iron Range, of course, went into a bit of a panic, and a professor from the University of Minnesota developed a process of taking waste rock that contained iron ore inside of it and concentrating that iron ore, producing what's called taconite, or low-grade iron ore resource. So in that context, then, we had a different definition of crustal abundance, one that was based upon the total amount of the high-grade ore, which was exhausted, as I said, by approximately 1950. And the second is the iron ore resource that we're working on now, the lower concentrated level of ore that needs to be concentrated into taconite. So we can talk about crustal abundance, that which is technologically feasible, and that which is financially feasible to extract. The boundary between technologically feasible and crustal abundance can shift depending upon technological advancement. On the Iron Range, we had the development of the technology to concentrate low-grade iron ore into taconite, making it possible to concentrate the iron ore into pellets that could be used in steelmaking. We also have another example of technologically feasible resources expanding by the fracking technology associated with petroleum resources. This is a fairly recent technology that allows oil resources to be extracted from certain kinds of rocks by breaking the rocks up, by fracturing them through subterranean explosions. So technological advancement can actually expand the definition of technologically feasible resource within a fixed definition of crustal abundance. Technological decline can also cause a shrinking of the technologically feasible, as when the original high-grade ore on the Iron Range was exhausted at the end of World War II. Technological decline of the resource shrunk the definition of technologically feasible resource. Then we have proven reserves, that which is financially feasible. And as prices increased for petroleum, the fracking technology became technologically feasible and financially feasible. So in that situation, the financially feasible expanded out into the technologically feasible by a considerable amount. We can also talk about a shrinkage of proven reserves, that is the financially feasible, depending upon market conditions. When the petroleum market goes bust, the proven reserves are diminished because it's no longer financially feasible to extract petroleum by fracking technology. Use of stock resources after their initial use is dependent upon technological feasibility and profitability of recycling the values over time. Inherently, this sets up the dilemma of intertemporal allocation in defining economic efficiency of use. How do we allocate a limited supply over time? Renewable resources are those environmental entities whose utilitarian values are continually produced. We can classify renewable resources in terms of the process of value renewal, talking about physically renewable processes such as blowing wind and flowing water, to processes of wind and water that allow us to generate energy. Wind energy in the case of blowing wind with turbines, and hydroelectric dams to take advantage of the potential energy in flowing water. Then we can also talk about biological renewable rates. This is rate of tree growth or rate of soil formation. When we're talking about renewable resources, we talk about the optimal rate of resource use being defined by the rate at which the values are being reproduced. If we use the resource at a rate that is higher than the rate at which the values of the resource are being produced, then we eventually wind up completely using up the renewable resource. So renewable resources are dependent upon use that is equal to the rate of renewal, whether it's biological or physical. I mentioned earlier the concept of intertemporal allocation dilemmas. This is a situation where present consumption of the resource imposes opportunity costs on future users. That is to say, current generation use of iron ore means that there's less iron ore left for future generations to use. And the current generation is imposing the cost upon future generations. In order to deal with this, present users must be bribed through interest rate payments to consider these opportunity costs, because a bird in hand is worth two in the bush. I've got the iron now, I'm going to use it. Through subsidies, then, we can come up with a strategy for balancing the distinction between present use and future use. As interest rates rise, the magnitude of the bribe and the costs to society increase. These are the opportunity costs of tending to the future. Renewable resources, as I said, are entities whose utilitarian values are. Second resource dilemma is called common property dilemma. Many natural resources are held in common by the state as common property, wherein, as Garrett Hardin told us in The Tragedy of the Commons, coercive action mutually agreed upon and adhered to is needed. Otherwise, users seek first and maximum use, resist imposition of restraints on use, and prevent others from getting there and using the resource first. Externalities dilemma is associated with residual byproducts and spillover effects of one use of resource on another use. There is an imposition of operating costs or benefits on actions of other users by virtue of an individual's behavior. These can be either negative externalities, negative external costs, or positive external costs. The classic example of negative external costs or negative externalities is associated with water quality, where the upstream user uses water, contaminates the water quality in the process of using that water, and discharges the contaminated water back into the river. In order for the downstream user to be able to use that water, she must pay the cleanup costs, that is, decontaminate the water in order to use it for the purpose that she wants to use it. So in this situation, then, the first user is imposing a negative externality, a negative external cost on the second user. They're called external costs because the user one creates the cost of having to clean up the water for the second user. The second user would otherwise not have to pay that, but because of user one's behavior, the second user has to pay the external cost of cleaning up the water in order to use it. We also can have positive externality costs. And I was very fortunate beneficiary of a positive externality. I bought a house in the mid-1970s in Maryland when I was teaching at the University of Maryland. And I sold it in the mid-80s for well over twice the value of the house. Well, obviously the value of the house goes up over time, but that value increase was very significant, and it was attributable to one factor. I happened to live in a community, New Carrollton, Maryland, which happened to be at the end of a new subway line that was constructed out of Washington, D.C. My house was located within a half mile of the New Carrollton subway stop station, which made it possible for people in my neighborhood to walk to the subway station. Suddenly, the value of my house went up by the action of installing the subway system in Washington, D.C. So I was a beneficiary of the public expenditure associated with building the Washington, D.C. subway system. Externalities create systematic behavioral incentives for those involved in them. Generators of externalities want to get paid for the positive externalities they create, and they either want to ignore the negative or have society assume the negative costs. Recipients of externalities want the generators to assume responsibility for negative, and they want society to assume responsibility for the negative or ride free on the positive. For example, with my house, no way did I want to pay the extra tax bill that was associated with the inflated value of my house associated with building the New Carrollton subway stop. There are also transaction costs dilemma. This is associated with resolving intertemporal common property and externalities dilemmas that involves identifying all of the users of the resource, assessing all of the damages that are created by use of the resource, and distributing the damages among the users. When the number of users is small, or we have what's called a small numbers case, the transactions cost dilemma is easily resolved through adjudication. For example, if I have a dispute with my property owner and I claim that the property owner is causing a negative externality to me because of the way she's using her property, I can sue her. And there's only two of us involved. It's very clear who's involved. It's very clear what the externality is. There is a mechanism called the courts that allows me to try to resolve the negative externality. It's these large numbers cases where there are many users of the resource and many different kinds of damages that are associated with it, make it difficult to identify all the recipients and the generators, as well as to calculate, assign, and distribute damages. Unfortunately, land resource issues tend to be large numbers cases. So we have the inherent dilemma of dealing with this large number transaction cost dilemma.